Great. The son of an American father and Colombian mother, Larry Pittman was born in Los Angeles in 1952 and attended Cal Arts as both an undergraduate and graduate student in the 1970s. He is a cornerstone of the contemporary art scene in Los Angeles, where he lives, and he also regularly spends time in Mexico City, where he finds inspiration in the traditions, aesthetics, and customs of the city. Larry has held numerous solo and group exhibitions around the world, including retrospectives at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles in 2019, Museo Jumex in Mexico City in 2022, the Long Museum in Shanghai last year, and the Jeonnam Museum of Art in South Korea earlier this year. This exhibition, titled Caprichos and Nocturnes, is his fourth exhibition with Lehman Mopin Gallery and his second here at the Seoul location. The exhibition brings together two series of paintings that were both created in 2015 and which collectively unfold an interwoven narrative that reveals Larry's artistic exploration of beauty, violence, and the complex interplay between fantasy and reality. So Larry, welcome back to Seoul. This is your second trip to South Korea this year, but you've been coming to Seoul intermittently since your previous show here in 2022. Thought we might start just by asking, what does this city sort of mean to you, and what images or ideas do you associate with Seoul, maybe as opposed to or in alignment with your homes in Los Angeles and Mexico City?
Well, first of all, my apologies that I can't address you in Korean. I really wish I would be able to do so, because I'm sensitive to the fact that language is a very complex thing. I just don't have that accuracy in Korean at all. But I hopefully, with a good translator, will be able to communicate effectively, which I know you will. My first very, very strong impression was when I've been here the 3 times, in going to museums and to galleries, the first thing that struck me very strongly is the allotment of time by the Korean audience to a singular object that is much, much longer than the way Americans look at art, which is much faster and not as contemplative. And since I come from Los Angeles, which is the least Eurocentric city in the United States, large city, and it's incredibly complex and pluralistic. And as we all know, American society does not run by consensus. It runs through argument. It's always been a violent and argumentative culture. And one of the things that strikes me very strongly, as it does in Latin America, since I'm half Latino, is that there is, in cultures where it's more unified by a singular language and cultural backgrounds, the idea of consensus creates a type of kindness and formality that's agreed upon, by which you interchange with each other, that I'm certainly not used to living in Los Angeles. And then the third thing is, as an artist and as a painter, I love looking at painting primarily. And what has been incredibly impressive is to expose myself to the painting practices of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and a really very, very strong commitment to what I would call non-denominational abstraction, and less of a reliance on instrumentalizing cognitive imagery to create. So without reaching towards cognitive imagery, it's the power of abstraction in Korean painting from that time is still able to create a sense of narrative experience and personal identification with the viewer. And just one more quick observation, and looking at the audience, it makes me very happy that the overwhelming attendance is women.
All right, let's get into the exhibition and the works that you've brought for this audience this time. Again, it's called Caprichos and Nocturnes. The Caprichos is a reference to Francisco Goya's sort of seminal series, Los Caprichos, which he created between 1797 and 1798. And it was a real turning point in his practice that was accompanied by a protracted physical and mental breakdown. This was before he started working on his so-called Black series of paintings, which everybody's very familiar with. But it was sort of after his period as a court painter, in sort of working within and among the upper class and the elites of Spanish society. And what we see in the Caprichos is really the first time that he's experimenting with a very sort of acerbic and cynical perspective toward the social order in Spain and the rest of Europe at the time, as the Enlightenment was sort of winding down, and in the years before Napoleon's invasion of Spain in the early 1800s. So there was a lot of Goya's own sort of personal turbulence that went into these works. And it was a series of 80 prints, each with an image and a caption. And the caption was often very satirical and very cynical toward the imagery that it depicted. And this imagery was often very disturbing, and sort of envisioned the decline of rationality, with themes of superstition and religious fanaticism, and also misguided morality, and moralizing that was taking place throughout Spanish society. The most famous of these caprichos is titled "The Dream of Reason Produces Monsters," which many of you are probably familiar with, as a very iconic image from that series. And so we're surrounded by Lari's caprichos paintings here in this room, and the imagery is also disturbing and produces a lot of questions in terms of its content and its meaning. And so, I'd like to start just by asking you, what do Goya's caprichos mean to you? What is the sort of relationship that you see between your paintings in this series and his, or is it just a shared title, and sort of the convenience that title maybe allows for your work?
Well, the word capricho, but I was really more interested in the adjective, which is caprichoso. And caprichoso really means a type of willful stubbornness. And so, that's also what I see in Goya's caprichos, is this kind of willful stubbornness. And maybe what I was talking with Andy a little bit earlier yesterday is that one of the things that that Western European painting did really well, I always see, especially Western European religious painting, which I see as fictive, of course, not real. It's a completely fictive construction. It was able to seduce the viewer by aestheticizing high thresholds of violence. So at the core of Western European religious painting is actually almost pornographic in its sense of the conflation of the seduction of violence and the reality of violence and the aestheticizing of violence. So that's something, as an atheist, I'm an atheist and so is my father, I admire Western European painting very much, but I see it as a construction of a fiction that was expertly able to seduce people who believed through the aestheticizing of violence.
And we're going to return to that theme we'll return to the theme of violence and its aestheticization later, but I wanted to touch on another important reference in this body of work, which is the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was an American poet born in 1830, which is 2 years after Goya's death, so they were not contemporaries. And although she wrote nearly 2,000 poems in her lifetime, they were not published until after her death in 1886. And her most creative and most prolific period coincided with the Civil War in America. And her poems from this period engage very deeply with themes of nature and life, and especially mortality. And the very sort of morbid sensibility of much of her work, written after 1861 and during the war, likely stems from the profound influence that the war had and the death and destruction that had on her own psyche. So you'll see the words of Emily Dickin's poems throughout these large caprichos works. And I'd like to read one of them for you after we just translate this introduction. So we'll read the poem. It was written in 1862. Emily Dickinson did not title her poems. So this was written in 1862, and it's the poem that's painted in this painting, Capriccio number 8 by Larry Pittman. And the poem goes as follows. They dropped like flakes, they dropped like stars, like petals from a rose. A wind with finger goes. They perished in the seamless grass. No eye could find the place, but God can summon every face of repealless list. So while the references to Goya's work in your paintings are not as direct, you're literally taking Emily Dickinson's entire poem and inserting it there, verses that respond to the violence and the destruction of the war. How do these words and these verses enter your consciousness in the production of these paintings? How do they find their way into the finished paintings?
Well, I guess having gone to CalArts as an undergraduate and graduate program, one of the things that was the mantra of my education was need before information. So you had to be willful enough to show that you could articulate and fabricate content to a certain degree. So I was thinking of how can I make a completely synthetic, artificial introduction by two historically unrelated people, but from my point of view, shared a certain distress, anger, tumultuous interior and exterior world, and make a kind of an introduction, and that introduction would actually make the paintings for me. Emily Dickinson was a strange combative match to Goya, but I like that fact. And one of the things that I've always liked about Emily Dickinson is that she, in the mid-19th century, graduated from college, was what I would call a proto-feminist, a femme lesbian, a completely liberated woman, an atheist, if not bordering on a type of existentialism herself. And that's, I think, what I thought, wow, this is a good date between the two. They can go out on a date, and somehow it was just my own being caprichoso, stubborn. I thought, no, I'm going to make this love match work in a certain way. And that's kind of what helped me create these paintings, was kind of a shared sensibility between the two.
So we have this pairing of these two individuals from different times, but dealing with similar issues. And I'm curious, words and phrases have often popped up in your paintings for decades. And so if we think about the painter Goya and the poet Emily Dickinson, I'm interested to hear sort of how do you think words that describe violence and images that visualize violence or pain or distress, how do they differ, if at all, from the perspective of representation or the perspective of expression?
That was an incredible question, Andy. Very good. I guess there have been appearances from time to time in the work of language. I don't necessarily see it as text per se. When I do use words in paintings, I want to somehow think that it's not me imposing something, an explanation over the painting, but what you're reading is the actual voice of the painting, not mine. That the painting has the capacity for this one moment to speak and to form language. I felt that the relationship of the imagery and the imagery and the poem felt as if they were ghosts, ghosts inhabiting haunting ghosts inhabiting the painting. And so when you look at Goya's work, it seems haunted. It's always haunted. And then the use of these poems by Emily Dickinson also have a very haunting quality. And it was really more that temperamentality that propelled the imagery more than anything else. So the words are never meant to be an illustration of the visual performance of the work or vice versa. I think that it's an idea of creating more of a parallelism that occurs between the two. But if they share some sort of temperament, is that of the haunted ghost that makes the imagery of the painting.
I think Goya would agree with that sentiment, especially with the caprichos, with those sort of, I call them captions, but they do seem as if that image is speaking it and not Goya himself is making any commentary. I thought we returned to the topic of violence and its aestheticization, because a sort of central belief that shapes your worldview and which you've spoken on extensively in the past is that we live in a world that is unrelentingly brutal and violent. You mentioned earlier that this violence has found its way into the history of Western painting, and particularly religious painting. But pairing these two words, aesthetic or aestheticized and violence together, is a really interesting combination. And I wondered, sort of, what does that mean to you? How did you come to that expression? And why is it such a powerful part of your practice?
It might seem at first that to call, for me to even think about aestheticized violence might appear callous, but I'm simply have been responding, at least in the course of my lifetime, is what is increasingly growing is what sociologists call empathy fatigue. And empathy fatigue creates a disassociation and a distancing from the actual horrors of violence. Or I even think of Hannah Arendt, whose thesis greatly debated, but of the banality of evil. And so, bless you. So those distancings that occur actually contribute, ironically, or maybe not ironically, to the streamlining or the flatlining of the actual impact of violence, which is a form of its constant aestheticization. In this case, I mean, maybe I go back in these paintings more to a mannerist idea of what aestheticizing is, as opposed to a maybe sometimes the type of aestheticizing that you see in cinema or even in pornography, you know. So mine is, I go back to an older idea, which is a form of manneristic aestheticizing. I would say that's closer for me to a queer camp aesthetic also, which makes sense to me as well.
I think we could talk about these caprichos paintings all afternoon, but there's another series of paintings in this show that I want to hear your thoughts about, and that's the Nocturnes series. And connecting back to the artwork titles and your sort of borrowing from Goya's series, the term nocturnes from the French refers to the temporality and sensibility of the nighttime, particularly the late night. But in a cultural context, it seems to be most commonly associated with musical compositions, a sort of musical form popularized by Chopin in his works for solo piano. And these works tend to feature melodies that evoke the phrasing and dynamism of singing. They're very lyrical in their melodies. They have a freely flowing sense of rhythm and use the sustain pedal quite a lot to create tension and drama throughout the composition. So I'd like to know if you feel that your nocturnes paintings align with that sort of mood and character described by those musical compositions, or were you trying to sort of explore alternatives to this interpretation? And perhaps, if you like, also to discuss what is the subject matter of these paintings, very different from the Caprichos.
I was making both of these sets of paintings at the same time, and it was not that the Nocturnes was not necessarily a counter reaction to making these somewhat gruesome paintings. That wasn't it. I've always loved, right from the beginning, deciding when I'm making a body of work, what are the weather conditions of a painting? Does it take place when it's sunny? Or are the paintings taking place at twilight, the advent of the evening? And I was really thinking more of the word nocturne or nocturnal. So it was more about placing experience in that twilight period. And one of the things for me about twilight, I love how in Las Vegas they call it the magic hour, when they turn on all the lights in Las Vegas. You know, that's this even synthetic, artificialized idea of transition. And so twilight is this amazing moment of transition. You maybe go home, you've worked, you assess the day, and then the evening is a little bit more about resignation somehow. Uh, Somewhat still, you know, there's a kind of bittersweet nature to twilight. You know, it's a transitional space. And that's kind of what impacted the making of the nocturnes. I think that they tend to be more experiential paintings. And I think one of the things that you mentioned in our conversation very cogently was about the idea of the grayscale of the making of the paintings. And I think these really function much more corporeally, much more experientially as a moment of transition. And the nocturne is a place where also one, the nocturne, maybe even in the music sense of it all, the evening is a moment where one can abandon oneself, or uh, there's this moment of self-abandonment, or of less of control as well. So, you know, I can see how each of these bodies of these two bodies of work were very different, but they were, regardless of my intentions, obviously communicating with each other, and I knew it. One more thing I want to maybe clarify or add to this is that I make emotional paintings, but I'm never in an emotional state when I'm making the paintings. I am not an expressionist. You know, I'm not an expressionist painter. Painting is not a vehicle for me to do that. But I think the works work emotionally and philosophically, but I do not have to be in that state to make these paintings. I actually lead quite a happy life.
Well, we're almost at the end here, but I just want to ask one more question about these works together, and thinking about when you made these works, which was 10 years ago. This is actually the first time that you're presenting these two series together in this focused, shared context. And I'm curious how these paintings, whether on their own or in relationship to one another, these two series, how have they maybe changed in your perspective over the past 10 years since you painted them? Do you feel the Caprichos still sort of emanate this stubbornness, and do the Nocturnes still really embody this sense of abandonment, or as you were saying before, dissociation perhaps from oneself?
In re-looking at these paintings again and bringing them together, it's always exciting, I think, for any artist to see work that's done in the past circle back around and maybe reconnect with how people are feeling or experiencing their contemporary lives. So this might be one of those moments for me that I'm excited, but it also gives me much sadness that we're circling around with a lot of these issues once again. But that means that, sometimes paintings can have some sort of agency for quite a while and then lose that agency historically. But it's nice to see that the world, for example, for me in looking at the nocturnes, there's a type of tristesse or isolation in them that I see the COVID pandemic in there, that kind of almost self-imposed on the spectrum autism that we all went through in a weird way, and a kind of, I don't know, a certain tristesse. I love that word. It doesn't exist in English in the same way. A kind of poetic sadness. In the caprichos, obviously, the rise of fascism globally again is alarming, very, very alarming. Certainly in the United States, very, very strongly. I grew up in a very politically progressive family. So it's interesting to see the kind of wantonness of behavior of what is clearly a fascist situation mounting and growing in the United States, but actually in countries all over the world. So I don't know why it's happening, but it's obviously a reaction to something. Let's say, for example, one of my favorite authors right now is a trans male, Masha Gessen, who has written extensively. She's Jewish and was born in the Soviet Union in Moscow, is now, I think, a professor at Yale. And her understanding of the complexities of what's happening in the Middle East, but she's also connecting it, what's happening in the United States, and certainly with Milei in Argentina, with your unfortunate neighbors up north, but I think it's not isolated anymore. What's alarming is how it's growing, and I think we're all very vulnerable in that way.
Well, that's quite a somber ending to our talk, but it's also quite a somber. It's quite a yes, a very happy artist. It's also a somber show, but I hope you'll take time to spend some time with these paintings and see how they respond or how you respond to them. And we will open it up to questions now. Before the questions, please join me in applause for Larry Pittman and our wonderful translator. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for such a deep and meaningful conversation. My question is probably very trivial. It's a curiosity, because focusing on this series, I noticed that aside from the text, there are two elements that are always there. The lines, this structure, and the domino tiles. And they both overlap. There are two elements that they overlap. They look like the very last layer that you put on the canvas. What do they represent for you?
Well, first of all, you really looked. I appreciate that.
They actually
yes.
match here.
Yeah, no.
6633, I don't know.
Yes. Oh, sorry. For example, great question. The lines are a reference to the page that in script Emily Dickinson would write her poems. And then the domino is when I originally showed the whole body of work together. When you play dominoes, you have to match up the number to the number next to it. So I had to line up and prepare I think there were 10 paintings at one time that they had to line up. But that's also a metaphor for the connection between Emily Dickinson and Goya. But here it's a physical connection that connects each painting. So it was a device, a kind of artificial device by which the paintings connected to each other, and then a way of showing that this is a written page as well of a notebook.
Thank you.
Oh, another question, come on. I can tell many of you are artists.
Yeah. So actually, I was also noticing that the dominoes and the lines. But one of the things that kind of struck me about it is the juxtaposition between those really angular shapes and, well, the other imagery, which I see a lot of nature, flowers and trees, and also a lot that kind of reminds me maybe of indigenous art, at least to my eyes. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about your intention behind that.
You mean the conceptual look of the paintings? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that I think goes back to my education as an artist, because at CalArts was a very experimental school in the 70s in the United States, and it was the first art school in America that was in no way related to the Beaux-Arts system of old. And it was the first school in the 70s that was inflected very strongly by the feminist art movement, first generation feminism, but also was the first art school that completely centralized media, popular culture, and so forth in the curriculum, whereas prior other schools did not do that. So mine was a revisionist art history curriculum. We looked at the modernist timeline, primarily the European and American modernist timeline. And it wasn't that we wanted to dismantle it, but we were looking at who was missing in that historical timeline, the canonical moments, the canons that were written about art. And what's not surprising is what's usually missing. We learned in the 70s that women were missing, queer people were missing, people of color and of different nationalities and social backgrounds. So, it was this alert all of a sudden. And so we studied all sorts of things, not just art history, but we studied decoration, pattern, interior decoration, textiles, the applied arts. We did not make a distinction that was prevalent, of course, in the modernist timeline to say that there is the applied arts and then there's fine art. So that was also banished very early on. So it really is to see all, let's say to your question, all the levels of kind of decorative performance of the paintings really are rooted in my education and trying to bump them up in status as actually conceptual maneuvers.